Tonight you'll fall asleep inside the Cold War's forgotten files, secrets so strange they shaped your world without you ever knowing. This isn't a lecture. It's a second-person immersive journey. You won't just hear about spies and satellites. You'll drift through fake passports, vanished scientists, and machines that whispered the future before we were ready. So close your eyes, forget what they taught you, and drift into the war they never meant you to see. You stand at the edge of 1945, where the dust of World War II hasn't quite settled, and yet already a new frost sharpens the air. The victors of yesterday eye each other with clenched jaws and competing ideologies. On one side, the United States, economic titan, capitalist heartbeat. On the other, the Soviet Union, bruised but unbroken, fueled by collectivist dreams and vodka-scented determination. And both of them, obsessed with one thing, knowing what the other is doing before they do it. No one trusts anyone, and yet everyone copies everyone. The Cold War doesn't start with a bang. It starts with a filing cabinet, locked, then duplicated, then copied by hand onto microfilm, stuffed into shoes, mailed in fake cereal boxes, or memorized by grad students who hate their supervisors. The information war has begun, and it doesn't wear medals. It wears lab coats and trench coats, and occasionally horn-rimmed glasses. You're not in a world of tanks and trenches now. You're in a war fought through photocopies, formulas, and faked resumes. Intelligence isn't just power, it's survival. The fear is subtle but ever present. It doesn't scream. It buzzes, quietly, like a Geiger counter, near something you shouldn't be standing next to. In a post-Hiroshima world, nuclear weapons are no longer theory. They're terrifyingly real. America has the bomb. For a brief, glimmering moment, it's the only country that does. That moment lasts roughly until some guy with access to lab notes decides ideological loyalty matters more than national borders. Enter espionage. The spies aren't glamorous. Most of them aren't even very good. They bumble, they get caught, but every now and then they deliver a photo, a diagram, a whispered conversation in a cafe where the salt shaker means proceed and the sugar bowl means abort. Cold War espionage is 95% boredom and 5% national security collapse. But it works. The irony, most of the great scientific leaps in this era don't come from clean innovation. They come from desperation, imitation, and sometimes pure accidental brilliance. Both sides fund ludicrous projects, not because they think they'll work, but because they're terrified the other side might already be trying it. And in that paranoia-fueled race, strange things get invented. A missile detection system the size of a gymnasium, a camera that drops from space and gets caught mid-air by a plane with a giant net, a reconnaissance jet made of metal bought from the enemy. None of this makes sense, but all of it happens. Historians still argue whether the Cold War was a geopolitical necessity or a massive overreaction to differing post-war ideologies. But what no one debates is its impact on technology. Most of the things we now take for granted, satellite navigation, high-speed data sharing, cloud computing, trace a straight line back to this era of secrecy and circuit boards. Your journey tonight won't follow battles. It'll follow blueprints, paper trails, whispered ideas passed from one desk to another, crossing oceans, languages, and security clearances. You'll walk the fluorescent-lit halls of secret labs in Los Alamos, eavesdrop on meetings in Moscow's ministry buildings, and stand beside launch pads where America tries, and often fails to catch up. And the strangest part, most of the Cold War's technological victories were unintentional. The US doesn't build the internet to connect humanity. It builds it to survive a nuclear war. The Soviets don't try to win the space race for Instagram bragging rights. They want to put a camera over Kansas. That humanity gets GPS and memes out of it is just a byproduct of two paranoid superpowers trying to one-up each other into extinction. But before we get to satellites and surveillance, before we meet the clunky titans of early computing, We begin where it all splinters, the moment when science, ideology, and fear become inseparable. So picture this. You're standing in a desert. It's 1945. The heat is dry, the silence intense. Then, without warning, the sky rips in half. The Trinity test has just detonated. It's the birth cry of the nuclear age, and the first secret that changes everything. Far away, a Soviet radio technician hears the signal echo in ways he shouldn't. In Washington, generals pretend they're calm. In Moscow, Stalin nods like he already knows, because of course he does. Klaus Fuchs is already taking notes. That blast isn't just the dawn of nuclear power. It's the starting gun of a race that lasts 45 years and builds the world you now live in. But that can wait until you wake up. You walk into a laboratory where everyone speaks in code, but no one says password. It's 1944, and inside the halls of Los Alamos, something monumental is unfolding, the Manhattan Project, the secretive, panic-infused, caffeine-fueled quest to build the most devastating weapon humanity has ever imagined. The United States believes it has a monopoly on destruction, but it's about to discover it also has a mole problem, or several. Meet Klaus Fuchs. He's not James Bond. He's not even Jason Bourne. He's a quiet, bespectacled, theoretical physicist who looks more like someone you'd forget you sat next to on a bus. But he becomes the atomic leak that turns the arms race into a sprint. Originally from Germany, he flees the Nazis and ends up in Britain, where he impresses the right people and joins the Manhattan Project. There, surrounded by nuclear ambitions and classified documents, Fuchs decides to take a second job, unpaid, for the Soviet Union. He copies blueprints, summarizes conversations, passes critical data to Soviet handlers. What he delivers isn't just formulas, it's the shape of the future. Historians still argue whether Fuchs truly understood the gravity of his betrayal, or whether, as some suggest, he saw himself as balancing power to prevent a single nation apocalypse. Whatever his motivation, he accelerates the Soviet nuclear timeline by years, not days, not months, years. By August 1949, the Soviets detonate their first atomic bomb, First Lightning, shocking a United States that thought it had at least a decade of solo world domination. The event shakes military confidence, public psyche, and Truman's breakfast coffee. The assumption? Espionage. The reality? Espionage. Confirmed and gift-wrapped with Fuchs's confession in 1950. Of course, no spy acts alone. Fuchs's arrest sparks a cascade of unraveling threads. Enter the Rosenbergs, Julius and Ethel, a married couple who allegedly pass nuclear secrets via handkerchief codes, furtive meetings, and spy rings worthy of daytime soap operas. Their trial becomes a media circus, a moral panic, and eventually a fatal conclusion. In 1953, they're executed, the first US citizens put to death for espionage in peacetime. But let's pause for a second, because this story, while dramatic, is also murky. Scholars and conspiracy theorists alike still debate the extent of Ethel's involvement. Was she a full-fledged collaborator, or a convenient scapegoat in a country desperate to show strength? The truth, like most Cold War facts, lies somewhere between the headlines and the archived footnotes. Meanwhile, the Soviet atomic program isn't just catching up, it's innovating with stolen shortcuts. The data Fuchs and others provide don't simply offer how-to instructions. More crucially, they reveal what not to do, all the dead ends and failed approaches American scientists already learned the hard way. In science, avoiding a rabbit hole is sometimes more valuable than finding a tunnel. The US response: lock it down. Background checks go from optional to obsessive. Security clearances become the new social currency. Your college protest in 1937, that's now grounds for denial. Your cousin's interest in Karl Marx. Say goodbye to government lab access. It's the McCarthy era, where loyalty oaths are more popular than coffee. Of course, the irony of Cold War secrecy is that it often backfires. By focusing so hard on internal threats, the US misses subtle signs of real infiltration. It becomes a game of performative patriotism, where proving you're not a spy is almost as hard as being one. But espionage isn't all gloom and betrayal. Occasionally, it's hilarious. One Soviet agent reportedly smuggled microfilm in a hollowed-out coin. Another hid notes inside a tampon. There's even an incident involving carrier pigeons and invisible ink that sounds made up until you realize, nope, that's just Cold War Tuesdays. And amid the paranoia, an important truth emerges. In a war built on technological supremacy, stealing blueprints becomes as vital as building them. The Soviets don't have Silicon Valley. They have patience, vodka, and a network of operatives who don't need to invent, just intercept. And sometimes that's enough. In Moscow, Stalin doesn't gloat. He simply nods. The knowledge of the American bomb doesn't surprise him. He's already seen the stolen sketches. What it does do is affirm a chilling reality. The Cold War won't be fought on the battlefield. Not yet. It'll be fought in labs, in back alleys, in dimly lit cafes, where one wrong word could end a career or a life. Meanwhile, you're standing in that same lab, watching the tension rise like reactor heat. The American scientists, many of them idealists, who thought they were saving the world from fascism, now realize their work might plunge it into new darkness. And across the globe, in secret bunkers and echoing halls, Soviet physicists, many of them equally brilliant, are reverse engineering destruction with borrowed blueprints. Both sides claim moral high ground. Both sides cloak themselves in security, and both sides know, deep down, that this is only the beginning. So here you are, between the whisper of paper trails and the whir of Geiger counters. The age of atomic espionage isn't about who's smarter, it's about who listens better. And as Fuchs, the Rosenbergs, and countless unnamed informants have shown, everyone's listening. But the skies, they're still quiet, for now, until the planes arrive. You look up at the sky, clear and untroubled, but somewhere above those innocent blue hues, a machine is watching. Welcome to the Cold War's next stage, the age of altitude. The espionage game leaves cafes and coat pockets behind and climbs into the stratosphere, where cameras fly instead of whispers, and every photo might tilt the balance of global power. It's 1955. The US is running blind. They've built atomic weapons, sure. They've interrogated enough nervous physicists to fill a football stadium. But what they haven't done is lay eyes on the Soviet landscape. Not really. Maps are outdated. Aerial photos are fuzzy, and rumors of massive missile stockpiles in Siberia have Pentagon generals waking up in cold sweats. America is paranoid, which, to be fair, is kind of its hobby at this point. So what do? They build a plane, but not just any plane. This one's part sailplane, part spy gadget, and part miracle of desperation. It's called the U-2, and it's about to make history and a spectacular international mess. Designed by Lockheed's mysterious Skunk Works division, the U-2 is a glider-shaped, awkwardly elegant contraption that flies so high, 70,000 feet, it basically skims space. Too high for Soviet fighters, too high for their missiles, or so America hopes. With cameras powerful enough to read newspaper headlines from the edge of the atmosphere, it's the ultimate peeping Tom, quiet, curious, and absolutely gloriously illegal. The US government naturally claims it's a weather research aircraft, because what else would be flying above missile silos with high-resolution lenses? Just checking the cloud coverage over Moscow, they might have said, while snapping military installations with the subtlety of a paparazzo outside. For a few years, it works. The U-2 sends back thousands of images, Soviet bomber factories, missile sites, troop movements. The US finally gets a look behind the Iron Curtain without needing a single human to risk their trench coat in a smoky alley. Intelligence analysts rejoice, generals exhale. But, and this should be carved above every Cold War doorframe. Nothing stays secret forever. On May 1st, 1960, pilot Francis Gary Powers takes off from Pakistan on what should be a routine overflight of Soviet territory. He packs a cyanide pill, just in case. The flight goes smoothly until it doesn't. The Soviets, tired of American high-altitude showboating, fire an S-75 missile into the stratosphere. It detonates behind the U-2, turning the back of the aircraft into modern art. Powers ejects. The plane crashes. The Cold War gets a new headline. Here's where it gets deliciously awkward. The US immediately denies everything. Weather plane, they shout, presumably with crossed fingers. But the Soviets have Powers, alive. They have the wreckage. They even have the camera, intact, with undeveloped film still inside. The Kremlin doesn't just have receipts, they have negatives. Historians still argue whether Eisenhower authorized that particular flight. What's clear is this: the US is caught, pants down, passport in hand. The diplomatic fallout is nuclear. Figuratively this time, a planned summit between Eisenhower and Khrushchev collapses. The Soviets stage a show trial. Powers is convicted of espionage and sentenced to 10 years, though he'll eventually be traded back in a spy swap that feels more like a plot twist than real life. But the bigger story, the U-2 isn't obsolete because it got shot down. It's obsolete because, drumroll, humans are about to launch cameras into space. Yes, satellites, the ultimate snoops. No cyanide pill required. Still, before the satellites blink awake, the U-2 remains a kind of airborne legend. It even spawns a successor, one faster, sleeker, and more titanium-filled than anyone thought possible. But that is for another night. Meanwhile, the Soviets study the U-2 wreckage, like archaeologists dissecting an alien probe. They reverse engineer, they hypothesize, they copy, and somewhere in the mix, Cold War innovation does what it does best, transforms failure into acceleration. The US, not to be outdone, begins thinking even higher. If you can't fly over the Soviets without getting shot down, why not fly past them, upward, into space, where international laws are murky and physics is your best defense? But even as they reach for the stars, the US knows one truth remains. Cameras don't lie, and for now the U-2 has told them stories they could never have dreamed. That the bomber gap, fiction. The missile gap, mostly propaganda. That paranoia can be both a strategy and a delusion. And most importantly, that every secret, no matter how high you fly, casts a shadow. So you stand on that runway in Nevada, watching as a strange swan-winged plane drifts upward like a ghost. It disappears into blue silence, carrying film, fuel, and $50 million worth of plausible deniability. It's not a warplane, it's not a tourist, it's a question mark at 70,000 feet. And for now, it's enough. You're drifting somewhere over Cuba now, not physically, but in the tense, sweat-damp paranoia of October. The Cuban Missile Crisis doesn't creep in, it slams. The Cold War, so far a game of sidelong glances and whispered betrayals, finally looks you in the eyes and dares you to blink, and you're not sure you can. It begins with photographs, grainy, haunting, and taken by a U-2 flight over western Cuba. They show long cylindrical shadows stretching across cleared patches of jungle. Missiles, Soviet, nuclear capable, less than 100 miles from Miami. It's as if the Soviet Union has set up camp in America's front yard, brought their own fireworks, and decided not to knock on the door. President John F. Kennedy receives the briefing, stares at the black and white proofs, like a man being shown a future he's not sure he survives. For 13 days, the world spins a little slower, or maybe just more fearfully. The US Navy establishes a quarantine, a softer word than blockade, around Cuba. Soviet ships approach, nuclear subs lurk, tensions climb, and for once it isn't just political theatre. This is the closest the world has ever come to full-scale thermonuclear war. You can almost hear the clocks freeze. Inside war rooms in both Washington and Moscow, men in suits argue over definitions. What counts as aggression? What qualifies as a first strike? What exactly is sanity worth if it means looking weak? Historians still argue whether the US had any intention of actually invading Cuba, or whether the show of force was just that, a performance, hoping the Soviets would blink first. But here's the twist. Neither side wants to die, they just want the other to sweat. Enter diplomacy, or more accurately, back channel, cloak and dagger diplomacy. Through secret messages and hasty communiques, an agreement begins to form. The US promises not to invade Cuba. Quietly, they also agree to remove Jupiter missiles from Turkey, but only if the Soviets keep that part hush-hush, like a secret handshake between superpowers. Khrushchev, ever the chest thumper in public and the chess player in private, agrees. The missiles come down, the ships turn around, the world exhales, barely. But you don't forget that breathless silence, because now you understand something crucial. Nuclear war is not hypothetical, it's choreography. One misstep, one panicked order, or misread radar blip, and civilization teeters. Of course, the lesson both sides take away is not let's cool off. No, it's let's prepare better. This is the beginning of mutually assured destruction, a doctrine that sounds like a villain's motto, but is, in fact, the world's weirdest peace treaty. You don't bomb me because I'll bomb you harder. It's logic by way of hostage standoff. As missiles come down in Cuba, they go up elsewhere. Silos multiply like mushrooms after rain. Submarines equipped with nuclear warheads begin patrolling the depths, quiet and angry. Bomber aircraft, armed and airborne, circle tirelessly, not to attack but to be ready, always ready, because the Cold War is now colder, darker, and armed to the teeth. And the people, they duck and cover. That's the advice. As if your wooden school desk could absorb a thermonuclear shockwave. Children practice nuclear drills, hiding their wide-eyed fear behind giggles. Families build fallout shelters stocked with canned peaches and vague hope. And every neighborhood has that one guy who takes it too seriously and installs a Geiger counter next to the barbecue grill. But under the absurdity lies a deeper shift. This is when the Cold War becomes real to the masses. It's no longer just the concern of generals and spies. Now it lives in the daily rhythm, in public service announcements, in the what-ifs, whispered at night, in the surreal knowledge that at any moment someone somewhere might press a button that erases it. It also births a new kind of power, media influence. Kennedy's calm, televised address about the missiles cements his public image as cool under pressure. Khrushchev, though less telegenic, manages to project strength without tipping into recklessness. The Cold War is not just fought with weapons now. It's fought with speeches, with photos, with the optics of restraint. And as the crisis fades into memory, it leaves behind a scar, a psychological Cold War embedded in culture. Movies, books, and games obsess over nuclear apocalypse. Artists and scientists alike begin to measure time not in decades, but in potential megatons. You sit back, exhausted but oddly awake. The missiles in Cuba are gone, but the arms race isn't over. It's just gotten better at hiding. In space, in underground labs, in whispered treaties with footnotes that read like riddles. And the next stage, it won't be about where the missiles are. It'll be about what else you can weaponize. But that can wait until morning. Now imagine you're drifting over a vast desert, not a mirage, not a dream, but the barren, blistering expanse of Nevada. Welcome to Area 51, the loneliest airstrip you've never officially heard of. It's 1955, and under a sun that burns like classified ambition, Lockheed engineers are unpacking something that looks more origami than aircraft. It's the U-2's weird, high-speed cousin, the SR-71 Blackbird. The Cold War is evolving. And with it, espionage gets an upgrade. You no longer rely on slow gliders sneaking snapshots at the edge of space. No, you're entering an era of supersonic arrogance. The Blackbird doesn't tiptoe, it roars at Mach 3. To the untrained eye, it looks like a futuristic alien dolphin, sleek black titanium scaled. And that last bit matters, because titanium is what allows the SR-71 to withstand the skin-peeling friction of its insane speed. Fun fact, the US had to secretly buy that titanium from the Soviet Union using fake companies and covert shipping routes. Yes, you read that right. In order to spy on the Soviets, America sourced its spy plane parts from the Soviets. The Cold War is nothing if not poetic. And what does this bird of prey do? Exactly. It flies so fast and so high that by the time a missile is launched, it's already gone. Or as Blackbird pilots like to say, you can't hit what you can't catch. It's not just speed, it's an insult wrapped in a jet engine. Inside the SR-71 is a camera system, so advanced it makes modern Instagram filters look medieval. This isn't about blurry glimpses. This is about map-grade photographs of enemy installations, missile sites, troop concentrations. One flight can photograph 100,000 square miles. And no, that's not an exaggeration. You sit inside this jet, imagining yourself surrounded by blinking analog dials, oxygen hoses, and the kind of cockpit environment that can cook a frozen steak by proximity. At full throttle, the aircraft's surface gets hotter than your oven at Thanksgiving. The engineers had to design the jet to expand in flight, yes, grow slightly, because the metal swells with heat. That's why it leaks fuel when grounded. It's not broken, it's just... The Soviets try, of course. They fire hundreds of missiles. They scramble interceptors. They curse in very technical Russian. But they can't catch it. The SR-71 outpaces them all. A black whisper across the stratosphere. Historians still argue whether its missions were more deterrent than intelligence, more about flexing than finding. But here's the kicker. The Blackbird never loses a crew member to enemy fire. Not once. That's not luck. That's precision. And still the Blackbird's greatest asset isn't its speed. It's time. Because while satellites are impressive, and they're coming soon, they orbit on set paths. Predictable. Schedule-bound. But the SR-71, you can launch it when you want, where you want. It's freedom with afterburners. Meanwhile, in Soviet bunkers, generals gnash their teeth. They know they're being watched. They just can't do anything about it. It's surveillance without consequence, vision without vulnerability, a ghost that takes notes. Back in America, Area 51 becomes mythic, a no-name base hiding next-gen wonders. Pilots sign NDAs longer than novellas. Test flights happen at twilight, and every now and then a local rancher sees something shiny overhead and swears it was aliens. The government smiles and lets the rumor live. Better UFOs than US reconnaissance aircraft, right? And so the Blackbird glides through the Cold War like a rumor with wings, untouchable, unknowable, and unbelievably fast. It doesn't just gather information, it redefines it. You aren't spying if they can't stop you. You're observing, curating, hovering above geopolitics with a smirk and a camera lens. Eventually, satellites will catch up, but for now, the SR-71 rules the skies. It's part machine, part myth, and when it flies, even the clouds hold their breath. You settle back in your seat, lulled by the purr of hypothetical engines, and the knowledge that for a while America didn't just watch the world, it outpaced it. And the chase, oh, it's only just begun. You've left the clouds behind now, not by flying higher, but by firing into orbit. Satellites, the new spies, no cockpit, no cyanide pills, just cold, blinking eyes in the void. It's 1957, and the Soviets have just launched Sputnik, a beeping metal beach ball that sends pulses into the sky and fear into American hearts. You wouldn't think a 58-centimeter aluminum sphere would change the world. But then again, No one expected to hear the first heartbeat from space echoing on their radio sets. That beep beep wasn't just a sound, it was a proof of concept, a glittering message from above that said, "We can see you from anywhere." The United States, momentarily stunned, gets moving, fast, because Sputnik doesn't just orbit, it rewrites the rules. The Soviets have proved they can launch payloads across continents. If they can launch a satellite, they can launch a warhead. Now space isn't the final frontier, it's the next battlefield. The American response. First panic, then paperwork, then rockets. And not just for show, for surveillance. Enter the age of photo reconnaissance satellites, the celestial paparazzi of geopolitics. But first, the problem: how do you get film back from space? There's no FedEx Dropbox on the moon. The solution is absurdly brilliant. Launch a satellite with a camera, snap photos of the Soviet Union, then eject a film capsule and have a plane catch it mid-air as it parachutes back down. Yes, that's real. Yes, it worked. Sometimes. It's called the Corona Project, and it's America's first real foray into orbital espionage. Approved in 1958 under the cover of a weather observation program, it represents the kind of Cold War logic only bureaucrats and Bond villains can truly appreciate. Gather data from the heavens, develop it on Earth, deny everything. Corona's first attempts are, let's be generous, chaotic. Rockets explode, capsules miss their targets, film melts, but in August 1960, Discoverer 14 succeeds. It photographs 2.4 million square kilometers of Soviet territory and lands its payload safely into the hands of very relieved American analysts. For the first time, the US sees a clear, undeniable image of Soviet missile bases, bomber airfields, nuclear facilities, all from above. No more guessing, no more rumors, just unblinking proof. And what do they learn? That the Soviets have fewer missiles than expected, that the missile gap politicians love to fearmonger about. It's imaginary. Suddenly, America can see, and what it sees is less threat, more bluster. That's the power of orbital truth. It punctures propaganda. But Corona is just the beginning. Satellite tech evolves faster than a teenager's playlist. Better cameras, faster returns, more orbits. Eventually, it's not just military analysts who benefit. Weather forecasting improves. Global communication takes off. Mapping becomes an exact science. Your GPS app owes its existence to those early sky spies. Meanwhile, the Soviets launch their own reconnaissance satellites. The race is mutual now, a celestial arms race. For every American lens, there's a Soviet counter-lens. Eyes watching eyes watching eyes, and all of it happening above the law. Because back then, space is a legal grey zone. There's no FAA for orbit, no keep-out signs beyond the clouds. Historians still debate whether these satellite programs prevented war or merely delayed it, but one thing's certain, they changed the stakes. You could no longer bluff easily when your opponent could see your cards from space. Secrecy became vulnerable. And Corona, despite its Cold War hush-hush origins, becomes the grandfather of modern surveillance. It introduces ideas like target prioritization, orbital scheduling, real-time data analysis, all things we now take for granted in civilian life. Your weather app, your Google Earth stroll, they're peacetime echoes of war-era genius. As you float deeper into the Cold War dream, you realize this: satellites didn't just take photos, they took control of narrative, of information, of power. So you tilt your head skyward, just a little, because even now, even in sleep, something might be watching. Now drift down, softly, into the hum and clack of machines, early computers, all wires and vacuum tubes, buzzing away like anxious librarians. It's not glamorous yet, no glowing screens or friendly icons. These are beasts of logic, born in bunkers and government labs, and they don't play solitaire. They calculate destruction. The Cold War is data-hungry. Nuclear strategy isn't about guts or guesswork anymore. It's about numbers. Grim arithmetic on blast radii, fallout drift, kill zones. Enter ENIAC, the electronic numerical integrator and computer, weighing in at 27 tons of what the hell is this thing. It consumes 150 kilowatts and covers an entire room, the world's first real digital computer, and it's doing what humans can't, modeling atomic war. You stand next to it, or rather, you squint up at its towering racks, blinking lights, endless cables. It's less like a machine and more like a nervous system with stage fright. Reprogramming it takes weeks, and operating it is a team sport. But still, it's faster than any general's gut feeling. And that's all the military needs to fall in love. ENIAC gives way to EDVAC, then UNIVAC, and before long the Pentagon is full of glowing boxes with intimidating names. They don't just help build bombs, they calculate missile trajectories, simulate Soviet responses, and even predict fallout spread in various weather patterns. Computers become war's nervous system, and the Cold War, more than any before it, is fought in punch cards and subroutines. And then comes a thought, what if we connect these machines? This idea hits hard in the 1950s. War planners start to panic about survivability. If Moscow nukes Washington, what happens to command, to communication? They need a way to ensure orders can still move. That information can flow even if the core is gone. Enter SAGE, the semi-automatic ground environment, a monstrous, beautiful Frankenstein built by MIT, IBM, and the US Air Force. It's the first real-time networked computer system. SAGE is designed to detect and respond to incoming Soviet bombers. It collects radar data from across the continent, processes it in central computers the size of small libraries, and sends interception orders to fighter jets and missiles. It's not just software, it's national adrenaline, pumped through circuits. You sit at a SAGE terminal, peering into the cathode ray screen, stylus in hand. You move a cursor, yes, one of the first in history, to track a simulated target. That blinking blip could be a nuclear bomber or a weather balloon. Either way, your input could launch a squadron. Of course, by the time SAGE is fully operational, ICBMs have made it almost obsolete. You can't scramble jets against a missile that travels 15,000 miles in 30 minutes. But no matter, SAGE does something else. It teaches us to think in networks. It creates the foundation for modern computing, multitasking, user terminals, real-time feedback, remote access. These aren't App Store buzzwords. They're military necessities from 1959. And then comes the really wild part. The airline industry steals the whole thing. Literally. Sabre, the world's first computerized airline booking system, is a civilian fork of SAGE. Yes, that check flight status screen on your vacation. It's a direct descendant of a Cold War bomber tracking console. Your weekend getaway was made possible by nuclear paranoia. You're welcome. Historians still argue whether SAGE was worth the billions it consumed. A technological marvel? Absolutely. A strategic asset? Questionable. But one thing is clear. It gave birth to modern systems thinking. For the first time, humans built a machine to synthesize national data and make decisions faster than politics allowed. And while it never fired a missile, SAGE trained a generation of programmers, invented new disciplines, and laid the groundwork for a world that would soon be wired, networked, and digitized beyond recognition. So rest now, surrounded by the gentle hum of memory and machine. You've just witnessed the moment the Cold War stopped being analog, the moment war became data. You descend now into a tangle of wires, switches, and dreams, into the minds of men trying to build the unkillable message. It's the early 1960s, and somewhere in a quiet Rand Corporation office, a man named Paul Buran is having dangerous thoughts. Not dangerous in the nuclear sense, dangerous in the structural, architectural, paradigm-shifting sense. He's wondering what happens when communications are decapitated, When enemy missiles knock out Washington and its phone lines, how do you send the launch order then? How do you talk when your mouth's been bombed off? The answer he finds isn't stronger lines. It's no lines at all. He imagines a network of nodes, decentralized, redundant, self-repairing. If one node falls, the others route around it. The message still gets through. In fact, he doesn't send messages. He breaks them into packets, each one with an address, a payload, and a casual disregard for linearity. These packets can travel by any route, reassembled at the destination. They form a complete thought. Barron doesn't call it the Internet. He's not that flashy. But his packet-switched model becomes the DNA of it. Across the ocean, in the UK, Donald Davis is having the same idea, almost simultaneously. Independent discovery, separated by context, united by Cold War urgency. Davis coins the term packet and publishes his work. His lab, the National Physical Laboratory, builds one of the first packet-switched networks, and yes, it works. Information is chopped, scattered, reformed, like cold pizza reconstituted into a Michelin meal. And then there's ARPANET, the US government's bold gamble. It's 1969, and the Advanced Research Projects Agency, ARPA, decides to test Barron and Davis theories. 4 universities link computers together: UCLA, Stanford, UC Santa Barbara, and the University of Utah. The first message? Logoon. The result? Crash after typing LO. The irony isn't lost. But it works. Eventually. And with that half message, history changes. The world gets its first taste of what it means to communicate non-locally, not via radio or TV, but computer to computer, machine to machine, logic to logic. No operator, no voice, just blinking silence and digital intent. You don't feel it at first. It's not loud, it's not glamorous, but it is foundational. ARPANET proves that computers can be more than calculators. They can be conduits, and the Department of Defense, naturally, gets excited. The military interest is obvious. In a nuclear war scenario, conventional communication infrastructure will vaporize. A packet-switched network could survive the apocalypse. The Internet isn't born from curiosity. It's born from existential dread. Soon ARPANET grows. More nodes, more institutions. Email appears. Then file transfer protocols. Then remote login. Scientists across states, then across countries, begin collaborating in real time, sharing data, code, ideas. Historians still debate whether this is the Internet's true Big Bang, not a public debut, but a quiet academic whisper that just kept spreading. Meanwhile, the Soviets are watching, or rather, failing to copy. They want their own network. They even have visionaries, like Viktor Glushkov, who imagines a nationwide computing system called OGAS. It would manage the Soviet economy, digitally allocate resources, and bring socialist planning into the electronic age. But the party says no, not because it's too expensive, not because it's too hard, but because it's too dangerous, too much data, in too many hands. That's ideological poison. They fear it will undermine centralized control, which, spoiler, it would have. So while the US stumbles toward a web of interconnected machines, the USSR clings to paper memos and typewriters. They fall behind, not because they lack technology, but because they fear transparency. Back in the US, ARPANET slowly, organically morphs. Commercial use is banned, but workarounds emerge. Universities experiment, hackers tinker, standards develop. Protocols like TCP/IP, invented by Vint Cerf and Bob Kahn, make networking scalable, flexible, democratic. And then something strange happens. It stops being just about war. What begins as a military experiment to survive nuclear annihilation becomes a platform for everything else. Bulletin boards, forums, software distribution. Eventually, pornography, memes, cat videos, all delivered via a network designed to withstand atomic fire. By the late 70s, ARPANET is quietly monumental. It's not on the news. It's not a political issue. But the digital nervous system of the world is forming, packet by packet, from government fear and academic boredom. You lean back now, warmed not by nostalgia, but by irony. The Cold War didn't just build bunkers, it built bridges. It created the tools for unity out of the logic of division. What was meant to endure the end of the world became the world's new beginning. And the story of the internet. Oh, it's still loading. You wake inside the cold glow of a radar screen, where dots dance like ghosts across green glass. But this isn't a haunted house. It's NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, and every one of those dots might be death, or, a flock of geese. Welcome to Cold War air defense, a high-stakes guessing game wrapped in blinking lights and caffeine. By the 1960s, the arms race isn't just about firepower, it's about reaction time. Missiles cross oceans in under 30 minutes. That's not enough time to have a meeting, draft a policy, or even finish your coffee. You need to know what's coming before it's airborne. Or better yet, know what the enemy might be thinking before they even decide. That's where early warning systems come in. Machines that try to outthink, outwatch, and outworry your enemies. You may remember SAGE, the semi-automatic ground environment that taught computers to share and defend. But that was just phase 1. Now the US wants global eyes, constant, vigilant, unblinking, and for that it looks upward. Enter missile detection satellites. These aren't recon satellites snapping pretty pictures of missile silos. These are infrared space sentries, watching for the hot flare of a launch. The logic is simple. If a missile leaves Earth, it gets warm, and space, conveniently, is cold. If something glows too hot, too fast, it's a red flag, or red flare to be precise. This becomes the Defense Support Program, DSP. Launched in the 90s, each satellite, orbiting in high geosynchronous position, stares down at Earth 20. A missile launch, anywhere on the planet, triggers a heat signature, which then sets off a chain of alerts, faster than you can say mutually assured destruction. It's like watching your enemy's heartbeat from space, and if it skips, you fire. Of course, watching for launches is only half the game. The other half, responding without falling apart. That's where we meet a Cold War unicorn, distributed command and control. You can't have just one central office pushing the nuclear button anymore. That's too vulnerable. So command is spread out across bunkers, silos, submarines. Redundancy becomes religion. This is when someone gets the bright idea to make a plane a flying nuclear command center. It's called Looking Glass, and it's exactly what it sounds like. A mirror of ground control, but airborne. In case Washington becomes a crater, this plane can keep the war going. It's terrifyingly optimistic. And there's more. The US builds underground silos filled with Minuteman missiles, each ready to launch on short notice. These missiles are tied into an elaborate web of cables and computers. Think of it like a nuclear nervous system. A twitch in Moscow leads to a reflex in Montana. Meanwhile, Soviet planners do the same. Their version, something called Perimeter, nicknamed the Dead Hand. It's a doomsday device. If their leadership is wiped out, Perimeter can automatically launch a counterstrike. Historians still argue whether it was ever fully operational, but the idea alone is chilling. A system built not to win, but to ensure everyone loses. So you've got space-based sensors, underground silos, flying command posts, and autonomous apocalypse software. What could possibly go wrong? Well, in 1983, we find out. A Soviet early warning satellite mistakes, sunlight reflecting off clouds for 5 incoming US missiles. Just 5, not enough for a full first strike, but enough to set off alarms. Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov is on duty. He's supposed to report it. Instead, he waits, disobeys protocol, trusts his gut. Turns out, he's right. It was a false alarm. You fall silent, realizing how close the Cold War came to ending with a computer glitch. In the end, It wasn't a machine that saved us. It was a man. That's the paradox of Cold War systems. The more perfect we made them, the more catastrophic their failures could be. Technology gave us eyes, ears, reflexes, but the soul, that stayed human. And so did the fear. You listen now to the quiet hum of satellites, radars, and warning systems, a global orchestra of caution, built to protect, ready to destroy, all of it humming in unison, waiting for a signal that, thankfully, never came. Sleep easy, for now the dots stay still. And now you stumble into the Cold War's final gambit. Its shimmering mirage, the dream of invincibility through lasers. Yes, we're talking about Star Wars, not the fun kind with Jedi and lightsabers, but the Reagan-era Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, where scientists, military planners, and aerospace contractors gathered to ask, what if we could just shoot missiles out of the sky? It sounds like science fiction, because it mostly was. Let's rewind. It's 1983, and President Ronald Reagan steps up to a podium and challenges the scientific community to rid the world of the nuclear threat, not by disarmament, oh no, but by building a space-based defense shield. His plan: use lasers, particle beams, satellites, and interceptors to create an invisible dome over the United States, one that could zap incoming Soviet missiles out of existence before they even got near Kansas. You blink, slowly, as if trying to focus on what that really means. And yes, it's every bit as outlandish as it sounds. The plan quickly gets nicknamed Star Wars, much to Reagan's chagrin. But the name sticks, probably because the alternative, calling it a multi-tiered kinetic kill system based on orbital weapons platforms, doesn't exactly inspire confidence. Now here's the thing, Reagan isn't entirely delusional. He genuinely hates nuclear weapons. To him, SDI isn't about dominance, it's about escape. He wants to render these awful tools obsolete, but his method is ambitious. Picture satellites orbiting Earth, bristling with death rays. Picture nuclear-powered platforms, tracking warheads in real time and vaporizing them mid-flight. Picture billions of dollars evaporating faster than you can say plasma cannon. The real tragedy: it nearly worked. Sort of. Projects like Excalibur, a nuclear-powered X-ray laser, were greenlit. Scientists like Edward Teller, the so-called father of the hydrogen bomb, jumped aboard. He claimed this technology could fry missiles in flight using a blast-powered laser grid. Of course, that required detonating a nuke in space to power it, which, has some drawbacks. So the US military threw money at defense contractors like Lockheed, Boeing, and TRW. Labs became playgrounds of improbable physics. Concepts included railguns, directed energy weapons, satellite mirrors, and even particle beams. These weren't prototypes so much as PowerPoint slides, brought to life with optimism and red ink. Historians still debate whether SDI was ever intended to work. Some believe it was a bluff, a pressure tactic to bankrupt the USSR by forcing them to compete in an unwinnable tech race. Others argue it was an earnest, if naive, attempt to leapfrog past mutually assured destruction. What's certain is this: it scared the hell out of the Soviets. From their perspective, SDI was a looming threat to nuclear balance. If America could reliably shoot down incoming ICBMs, then it might be tempted to launch a first strike, confident it could block retaliation. So the Kremlin scrambled. They poured money into countermeasures, decoy warheads, maneuverable missiles, and radar jamming. But more importantly, they looked inward and saw a problem that lasers couldn't solve: their economy. Soviet planners quickly realized they couldn't match SDI, not in resources, not in tech, and certainly not in optimism. And that realization, subtle and devastating, began to unravel the ideological certainty holding the Soviet Union together. Meanwhile, back in the States, SDI limped along, plagued by failures, cost overruns, and a healthy dose of physics. Interceptors missed targets, lasers overheated, Concepts collapsed under their own weight. The dream of missile defense slowly deflated into something more earthbound, ground-based missile defense systems like today's GMD. No orbital death cannons, no laser fences in the sky, just complicated radar, upgraded interceptors, and a budget with more zeros than successes. Still, the legacy of Star Wars endures. It reshaped global strategy. It showed that tech wasn't just a tool in the Cold War. It was the battlefield. Propaganda and perception mattered as much as reality, and SDI, for all its scientific silliness, proved that perception could shift the course of nations. And if you tilt your head just right, you can see its strange echoes in modern missile defense, in drone warfare, in space militarization, even in today's obsession with AI and cyber warfare. Reagan's dream didn't die. It simply mutated. So rest easy now. Under a sky that never got its laser shield, the warheads never came, the beams never fired. But for one flickering moment, we believed we could build peace through firepower and aim it at the stars. You drift now into the world of satellites, not the cinematic kind that explode in space or track rogue spies, but the mundane, mechanical marvels quietly spinning over your head. In the Cold War, they didn't just change war, they changed everything. Because while the world below was locked in ideological trench warfare, the sky was busy becoming a nervous system for the planet. It begins, like most techno-drama in the Cold War, with Sputnik. October 4th, 1957, the Soviets launch the first artificial satellite, a shiny metal sphere with 4 spindly legs and a chirping heart. It doesn't do much beyond beep, but its orbit shatters American confidence like a glass teacup in a tank tread. You don't forget that sound the beep heard round the world. It meant the Soviets had won a round. More importantly, it meant they could launch missiles. If they could get a radio sphere into space, what's to stop them from putting a bomb up there? The US response is swift, if not always graceful. Their first satellite launch, the Vanguard project, famously explodes in a fireball on live television. The satellite survives and pathetically rolls away across the launch pad like a stubborn soccer ball. Not America's finest hour. But soon they recover. Explorer 1 lifts off in January 1958, carrying a scientific payload. That payload discovers the Van Allen radiation belts, a discovery that's both interesting and terrifying. Suddenly we know space isn't just cold and dark, it's lethal, charged with invisible energy belts that would love nothing more than to fry your circuits or your astronaut. As both superpowers launch more satellites, they begin to realize space isn't just about bragging rights, it's about information. The Cold War is an information war, after all, and nothing gathers information like a satellite. First come reconnaissance satellites. The US launches the Corona program under a fake civilian name, Discoverer. They tell the public it's all weather and science. In reality, these satellites snap thousands of pictures of Soviet airfields, missile silos, and military installations, the kind of data you used to need a U-2 spy plane and a good insurance policy to get. Corona satellites drop film capsules from orbit. These parachute down through the atmosphere, and mid-air, planes snatch them with hook lines. Yes, it's as insane as it sounds, and yes, it works, most of the time. The amount of intelligence these early satellites gather dwarfs anything collected by spies on the ground. Whole sections of the Soviet Union are mapped in glorious black and white detail. Every missile installation, every suspicious building, every airstrip, all catalogued from the heavens. Historians still argue whether this satellite surveillance prevented World War III. Some say it did, by proving there was no missile gap. Others say it only intensified the arms race. Either way, the Cold War stopped being a game of guesses and started being a game of high-resolution truths. And the technology trickles down. The same systems used to photograph enemy bunkers eventually help track hurricanes, map forests, and guide agricultural planning. The Cold War's eye in the sky becomes Earth's mirror. Then comes telecommunication. Satellites become the arteries of global conversation, live broadcasts, secure government channels, international phone calls, all routed through space. It's like someone turned the planet into a walkie-talkie. And don't forget navigation. That smartphone GPS you use to find tacos at 2 a.m. It began with Cold War military satellites designed to guide submarines, aircraft and missiles. The first Navstar GPS satellites go up in the late 70s, for military use only. Eventually, civilian access is granted, but only after a few decades of paranoia and signal scrambling. Ironically, satellites born from secrecy become tools of global transparency. Weather forecasting, environmental monitoring, scientific collaboration. They show us the ozone hole, track deforestation, and let us spy on our own planet with the obsessive precision of a teenager stalking their crush on social media. Meanwhile, both sides flirt with turning satellites into weapons. There's talk of satellite-based lasers, kinetic rods, and even satellite-on-satellite dogfights. Some ideas are tested, most remain on the drawing board, because in the end, even Cold War generals realize something strange. The satellites are too useful to shoot down. They become like diplomats in orbit, unarmed, vulnerable, and slightly smug. But the tension never disappears. In the 1980s, the US begins tracking anti-satellite ASAT tests by the USSR. The Soviets, ever creative, experiment with space mines, tiny explosives meant to orbit quietly until needed. You try not to imagine what a space minefield would look like, because sleep is the goal here, after all. Today, many of those Cold War satellites are still up there. Some are active, some are junk, thousands of pieces of metallic corpses, slowly circling a graveyard of Cold War ambition. But they still whisper, in their way. Every time your phone pings a location, every time your internet purrs across oceans, every time we glimpse the Earth from above and remember that it's fragile, you're hearing an echo from the Cold War sky. Not with a beep this time, but with a blink of light that never truly turned off. You tumble gently into the humming, blinking cradle of early computers, vast hissing contraptions that once took up entire rooms just to multiply things. They look less like tools and more like angry industrial ovens having a nervous breakdown. But in the Cold War, these machines aren't just adding numbers. They're building empires, simulating annihilation, and eventually inventing the future we're living in now. It starts, as most things do, with fear. After which UI, the US military wants to calculate ballistic missile trajectories, and humans, it turns out, are too slow, too imprecise, and too fond of lunch breaks. Enter ENIAC, the electronic numerical integrator and computer, the world's first general-purpose digital computer. It's the size of a small house, uses over 17,000 vacuum tubes, and requires its own air conditioning system just to not melt. But what ENIAC lacks in subtlety, it makes up for in speed. Calculations that once took a human team weeks can now be done in seconds. It's like going from abacus to warp drive overnight. And so begins the computer arms race, a silent, methodical duel of logic gates and blinking lights. As tensions rise between the US and the Soviet Union, both sides see a clear opportunity. Computers can win wars, not just by building better bombs, but by simulating the end of the world faster and more reliably. If you can predict what the enemy might do, or how many cities might be vaporized in a first strike, you can plan, you can prepare, you can deter. But programming ENIAC is a nightmare. Rewiring it for new tasks takes days, sometimes weeks. That's not exactly battlefield ready. Enter EDVAC, the electronic discrete variable automatic computer. It introduces the stored program concept, meaning it can read instructions from memory instead of needing to be manually rewired. Suddenly, computers get brains. Primitive, slow brains. Sure, but ones that can be reprogrammed like a soldier changing outfits. This idea changes everything. Now, Cold War leaders realize computers aren't just oversized calculators, they're decision-making engines. They can simulate nuclear exchanges, predict weather patterns for missile accuracy, crunch spy satellite data, or say optimize bomber routes to avoid Soviet radar. They become central to intelligence, logistics, strategy, and control. Meanwhile, in universities and labs, and let's be honest, some very confused basements, programmers begin inventing software, not just machine code, but higher languages, Fortran, COBOL, that allow humans to talk to computers with something resembling grammar. This isn't just technological evolution, it's a new literacy. And like all literacies, it spreads. Military contracts fund university research. Defense departments send young officers to graduate school. Labs like MIT's Lincoln Laboratory become Cold War think tanks where cold warriors wield keyboards instead of rifles. The result is a culture of quiet genius, socially awkward, often caffeinated, and wholly obsessed with optimization. These programmers aren't household names. They don't stand at podiums or win elections, but they're building the architecture of the modern world, one subroutine at a time. The Soviet Union is watching. They're developing their own computing systems, though with a few hiccups. While American computing benefits from collaboration between military and civilian sectors, the Soviet model is more siloed, fragmented, and suspicious. Innovation stumbles. Proposals for a nationwide computer network to modernize their economy and government are shelved or crushed under bureaucratic fear. Historians still argue whether this technological gap contributed to the USSR's collapse. Some say yes, they couldn't keep up. Others argue it was one of many factors. But one thing's clear, computers gave the US an edge, not in weapons, but in coordination. This era also births one of the Cold War's biggest gambles, Project Sage, a computer system designed to detect incoming bombers and coordinate air defense. The system uses giant computers, radar feeds, and human operators in subterranean command centers that look like a cross between NORAD and a Bond villain lair. Sage even gives us the first computer display screens, light guns, and real-time graphics. Yes, your video games descend from nuclear paranoia. Sage is massive, ambitious, and ultimately kind of obsolete by the time it's done, because ICBMs make bomber defense less critical. But like many Cold War projects, its legacy far outlives its strategic purpose. It teaches an entire generation how to think in code. Now picture a young programmer at MIT in the 1960s, surrounded by blinking terminals, punch cards, and the faint smell of ozone. He's working on ARPA-funded software. He doesn't know it yet, but the tools he's building will become email, file sharing, remote loggings, the internet. The Cold War didn't invent computers, but it weaponized their potential, pumped them full of funding, and embedded them in every part of society, from stock markets to kitchen appliances. And in doing so, it gave birth to something terrifyingly beautiful, a world that can think faster than it can feel. You lie there now, surrounded by silent, unseen circuits. Every message, every ping, every whisper of ones and zeros around you is the echo of Cold War curiosity, and the realization that whoever controlled the data controlled the future. And now, through the tangled wires and buzzing circuits of Cold War computing, you step into the true digital birth canal, the ARPANET. It's 1969, Nixon is in the White House, the Vietnam War is raging, Woodstock has just happened, and somewhere in a dimly lit lab at UCLA, a student tries to send the word Lagoon from one computer to another 350 miles away. At Stanford, he types L and then crash. The system fails after 2 letters. Welcome to the Internet. Yes, the origin of the Internet begins with a failed login attempt, which feels oddly poetic considering how many passwords you've probably forgotten in your life. But before the beeps and pings of modern Wi-Fi, there was ARPANET, the Advanced Research Projects Agency network, born from Cold War necessity. It wasn't created to let people tweet or order pizza. It was built for something more urgent, more ominous, to survive a nuclear war. After the US realized their command infrastructure was vulnerable to Soviet missiles, thinkers at Rand Corporation, especially Paul Barron, came up with a radical idea. What if a communications network could survive even if part of it was obliterated? Instead of a single centralized hub, it would be decentralized, a spider web of nodes, where messages could reroute themselves around destroyed sections. Barron's concept, called packet switching, broke messages into smaller packets that could travel independently across different routes and reassemble at the destination. It was revolutionary, and it's still the foundation of how the internet works today. Meanwhile, across the pond, Donald Davis in the UK independently developed the same concept. Historians still debate who thought of it first, but in true Cold War style, it was a tie. Human innovation, it turns out, thrives under existential dread. So the US military-funded ARPANET becomes the testing ground. 4 sites are initially connected: UCLA, Stanford Research Institute, UC Santa Barbara, and the University of Utah. This modest network, powered by IMP computers, interface message processors, essentially proto-routers, becomes the nervous system of academic and military research. And then the magic happens. People don't just send data, they talk. They invent email, they share files, they collaborate remotely. ARPANET isn't just surviving nuclear war, it's making communication better. By the 1970s, the system grows. More universities join. New protocols are needed to manage traffic, ensure delivery, and make different types of computers play nicely together. Enter TCP/IP, Transmission Control Protocol, Internet Protocol, developed in part by Vint Cerf and Bob Kahn. These protocols become the universal handshake for networked computers, the Rosetta Stone of digital connectivity. And once those protocols are in place, it's like opening Pandora's inbox. Anyone who plugs into the system can talk to anyone else. The web of connections begins to thicken. The idea of a network of networks, what we now call the Internet, takes shape. But this isn't just about wires and software. It's about power. In the Cold War, being first wasn't just national pride. It was existential insurance. Whoever mastered information, its flow, storage, protection, could outmaneuver the other. ARPANET wasn't just a nerd's playground. It was a strategic asset. That's why the Department of Defense funded it. That's why no one really cared if it ever became public. It was built by Cold War logic, for Cold War goals. Ironically, the moment ARPANET proved most useful wasn't in war but in peace. Scientists used it to share papers, ideas, even jokes. Students used it to flirt. Some of the first flame wars happened over email. The first spam message appeared in 1978, a marketing email sent to 393 recipients. Civilization had arrived. And then, in the 1980s, ARPANET split. The military created its own separate network, MILNET, while the civilian academic side continued growing. Eventually ARPANET would fade, but its protocols, its ethos, its infrastructure would be inherited by the broader Internet. Historians still argue whether this evolution was inevitable. Some say we would have built the Internet eventually. Others insist that without Cold War funding and paranoia, we'd still be faxing each other jokes. What's not in dispute is this: the Cold War built the hardware of modern life. ARPANET's real triumph wasn't connecting machines. It was connecting people, researchers, scientists, students, who for the first time could collaborate without being in the same room. This invisible web slowly changed expectations. You didn't need to wait for a letter. You didn't need a library. You didn't need permission. You just needed access. And as you lie here in the gentle pulse of 5G and gigabit fiber, remember that it all started with a nuclear fear and a crashed login attempt. The very system now playing your lullaby was born in an age when every cable might one day carry a launch code. So sleep softly, wrapped in digital ether, because once upon a time they dreamed of networks that could survive the end of the world, and what they built was the beginning of ours. You drift deeper now into the parallel universe that almost was the digital dreamscape of the Soviet internet that never happened, because while the West was busy spinning its spiderweb of ARPANET nodes and packet-switched futures, the USSR was doing something different. It was dreaming big, maybe even bigger, but in a uniquely Soviet way, with suspicion, bureaucracy, and enough red tape to gift-wrap Siberia. The idea began innocently enough. Anatoly Kitov, a Soviet military engineer in the late 1950s, had a thought. What if we used our shiny new computers, those clunky vacuum tube behemoths, not just for military ballistics, but to manage the entire national economy? Imagine it. Factory quotas, production data, supply chain stats, all feeding into a central brain that could optimize everything. Bread, boots, and ballistic missiles, all coordinated in a real-time digital harmony. Sounds smart, right? The problem. Kitov made the fatal mistake of proposing that this computer system be shared between military and civilian sectors. A heresy in a country where turf wars between ministries made Game of Thrones look like a tea party. He was swiftly punished, his career curtailed, his Communist Party membership revoked, because in the Soviet Union, central planning was supposed to be done by humans with party cards, not machines with circuits. Even suggesting otherwise smelled dangerously like disobedience. But the idea refused to die. In the 1960s, a bold mathematician named Viktor Glushkov resurrected it with even grander ambition. His project, called OGAS, or National Automated System for Computation and Information Processing, envisioned a three-tiered structure. 1. A central computer hub in Moscow. 2. Hundreds of regional computing centers. Thousands of local terminals at factories and enterprises. It was the internet, decades before the internet, but not for tweets or cat videos, for planned socialism. Glushkov didn't want likes or retweets. He wanted real-time optimization of steel production and fertilizer distribution. And he was terrifyingly close to pulling it off. OGAS could have made the Soviet economy agile, responsive, and dare we say, efficient. It could have given Soviet planners a godlike view of the entire industrial machine. But that, as it turns out, was the problem. Because while Glushkov built the system, others saw something else, a threat to power. If machines were managing data, what happened to bureaucrats? If algorithms optimized the economy, what were ministers for? Every byte threatened a desk job. So naturally, the OGAS project hit a wall of passive sabotage. Funding delayed, approvals stalled, rival ministries refused to cooperate. It was a digital coup d'etat, and the old guard crushed it without ever lifting a finger. Historians still argue whether OGAS could have saved the Soviet economy. Some believe that had it been implemented, it might have made central planning viable in the computer age. Others argue it was doomed by the very nature of Soviet politics. Too paranoid, too fractured, too obsessed with control. What's tragic and a little ironic is that the USSR was ahead of the West in thinking about nationwide computer networks. The technology was rudimentary, sure, but the vision was there. They dreamed of what we now take for granted: digital dashboards of governance, algorithmic policy, instantaneous coordination. But they also feared it. And while the Americans were building ARPANET with government grants and grad students, the Soviets were drowning in feuds between ministries who couldn't agree on who'd get to plug in first. The result? The internet was born, just not there. Instead, Soviet computing stayed trapped in stovepipes, isolated mainframes, each doing its own thing, unconnected, uncollaborative. When the 1980s hit, the gap between East and West became a chasm. And the Cold War wasn't just about bombs anymore. It was about information infrastructure. You might think of this as a kind of Cold War Greek tragedy, a nation with the brainpower and ambition to lead the digital age, undone by its own obsession with control. And the real twist: to develop the technology that eventually beat them, the West had to act a little bit Soviet. The internet only exists because the US government funded it, regulated it, and coordinated research across universities and agencies, capitalists behaving like socialists. Meanwhile, the actual socialists couldn't agree on where to install a server. So as you float here in a Wi-Fi saturated dreamscape, remember that there was almost another version of the net, a command economy cloud, a bureaucratic internet, where instead of memes, you'd receive daily production targets from a terminal at your factory job. No scroll, no swipe, just wheat output updates. It didn't happen, but oh, it almost did. And somewhere in a dusty archive in Moscow, the blueprints for a different digital world still sit, quiet, forgotten, and just a little bit tragic. Now, as you hover somewhere between consciousness and circuitry, you're gently ushered into what was perhaps the most absurdly ambitious, theatrically named, and sci-fi infused Cold War techno-fantasy, the Strategic Defense Initiative. But you probably know it by its Hollywood nickname, Star Wars, because what's better than facing global thermonuclear war, facing it with lasers in space? The year is 1983. Ronald Reagan is president. His hair is perfect, and his speeches are full of cowboy optimism. The economy is shaky, but America's got swagger. And somewhere between morning briefings and jelly beans, Reagan has a big idea. He walks onto national television and says, in the gentlest possible voice, "What if we could make nuclear missiles obsolete?" Cue dramatic music. He calls upon the scientific community, the same folks who gave the world the hydrogen bomb, to pivot and create a shield. Not just any shield, a space-based missile defense system that could shoot Soviet ICBMs right out of the sky, with lasers and particle beams, from orbit. It was, to be fair, visionary, and also absolutely nuts. The Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, imagined a future where American satellites would patrol the heavens, waiting for any sign of a Soviet launch. The moment a missile lifted off, the system would detect it, track it, and vaporize it mid-flight, ideally over some uninhabited bit of the Arctic, where the only casualty would be a confused polar bear. The technical challenges? Only slightly easier than building a Death Star. First, you'd need advanced space-based sensors to detect launches within seconds. Then you'd need interceptors, potentially guided by ground or satellite-based radar, to target warheads traveling at 7 kilometers per second. You'd need lasers strong enough to fry metal in space, powered by nuclear reactors or solar arrays. And you'd need a command and control system that could calculate, decide, and fire within milliseconds, all without glitching, jamming, or crashing like your laptop on a bad update. Small stuff, really. But Reagan wasn't interested in the skeptics. He believed in American ingenuity and in forcing the Soviets into a kind of arms race they couldn't afford. Whether SDI would ever work was in a way beside the point. It was psychological warfare wrapped in tinfoil and optimism. Still, the scientists protested. Many called SDI unworkable, untested, or just plain fantasy. A few openly compared it to weaponizing unicorns. Even Edward Teller, father of the hydrogen bomb, had doubts about its feasibility, though he still pitched his own version involving X-ray lasers powered by nuclear blasts. Yes, that was a real thing. It was called Project Excalibur, because why not name your orbital weapon after a magical sword? Historians still argue whether SDI was a bluff, a genuine attempt, or both. The Soviets, meanwhile, didn't laugh. They panicked. If the Americans really could build a missile shield, then the entire doctrine of mutually assured destruction may AD depended on both sides knowing that any strike would result in total annihilation. If one side had a shield, even a partial one, it changed everything. So the USSR ramped up their own research, but their economy was already wheezing. Trying to match the US on laser space defense was like entering a Ferrari race on a tricycle. By the late 1980s, Soviet leaders quietly admitted to themselves, we can't compete with that, even if it's imaginary. And that, some say, was the point. SDI may never have worked, but it worked. It spooked the Soviets. It forced them to spend, scramble, and reconsider their strategic position. Whether it hastened the fall of the USSR is still debated, but it certainly rattled their confidence. Eventually, most of SDI's projects were scaled back or cancelled. The Cold War ended, Reagan's laser dreams faded, but SDI left behind a trail of technological breadcrumbs. Some of its research led to modern missile defense systems, some fed into surveillance and tracking technologies, and some just vanished into classified folders marked "nice try." But the psychological legacy remained, because nothing screams Cold War paranoia like the idea that nuclear missiles might one day be stopped by orbital mirror arrays and X-ray swords. So as you nestle deeper into your pillow, surrounded by smartphones and streaming services, remember that just a few decades ago, world leaders sincerely believed they could build peace through space lasers. And honestly, compared to some of today's online threats, maybe they weren't wrong. Drifting now into the cooling embers of this Cold War night, you find yourself surrounded not by lasers or satellites, but by whirring machines, hulking metallic boxes, and a humming that vibrates like a low chant through history's technological catacombs. Welcome to the realm of Cold War computing, where computers were the size of garages and debugging sometimes involved actual bugs. No, really, moths stuck in relays. We're back in the 1940s and 50s, when the word computer didn't mean a screen and keyboard, but rather a team of humans, mostly women, crunching numbers by hand for ballistics calculations, war maps, and missile trajectories. These were the original processors, overworked and underpaid, churning out data for generals who often had no idea where numbers ended and miracles began. But then came a beast, ENIAC, the Electronic Numerical Integrator and Computer, developed at the University of Pennsylvania during World War II and operational by 1945. ENIAC was the world's first general-purpose digital computer. It had 17,468 vacuum tubes, consumed 150 kilowatts of electricity, and could fire off calculations at unprecedented speed, provided, of course, that you didn't mind it taking weeks to program. It filled an entire room. It was loud. It was delicate. It was a diva. And yet, it changed everything. Because once ENIAC proved it could outthink the fastest human math minds, military planners saw potential. If this clattering colossus could simulate artillery trajectories, why not thermonuclear blasts? Why not simulate the very physics of the atom? Soon ENIAC was being used to help with calculations for the hydrogen bomb, the sequel to Hiroshima, now with more zeros and fewer survivors. Then came EDVAC, the Electronic Discrete Variable Automatic Computer. While ENIAC was programmed manually, plugging cables like a demented phone operator, EDVAC introduced the stored program concept, where instructions were held in memory. Revolutionary. It meant that, instead of being rebuilt for every task, the computer could reprogram itself, sort of like if your fridge suddenly knew how to file taxes. This idea, proposed by John von Neumann, became the blueprint for nearly every computer built since. Without it, you wouldn't have laptops, or TikTok, or accidentally liking your ex's post from 20. As the Cold War intensified, these machines moved from labs to military bunkers. They were used to simulate nuclear detonations, track Soviet submarines, even analyze spy plane photos. But there was a problem. They weren't connected. Each machine was an island, powerful but alone, which was fine if you were trying to model radioactive fallout, less ideal if you needed to share intelligence across the country in real time. Enter the idea of networked computing, By the late 1950s, the US military was staring down a chilling question. What happens if a Soviet nuke takes out your central command? How do you fight a war without a brain? And the answer was SAGE, Semi-Automatic Ground Environment, built by MIT and IBM. SAGE was a massive continental radar and communication system designed to detect incoming Soviet bombers and coordinate defense responses. It was the size of a shopping mall and cost more than the Manhattan Project. And it had a single purpose, not to win a nuclear war, but to make sure we knew we were losing one in real time. SAGE had giant screens, light pens, think proto-mouse, and thousands of miles of telephone lines. Operators could see blips on a screen, aircraft, missiles, and scramble jets within seconds. It could track up to 400 plans simultaneously and issue intercept commands automatically. It was real-time warfare management in the age of rotary phones. But there's a twist. Just as SAGE was finally operational, the nature of the threat changed. Bombers were replaced by intercontinental ballistic missiles, too fast, too high, and too sneaky for radar nets. The system built to protect against one kind of apocalypse was suddenly useless against a new one. Still, SAGE wasn't a failure. It pioneered real-time computing, data sharing, graphical interfaces, and user terminals. The airline industry would later borrow its ideas to build reservation systems. The US government would use its architecture to start experimenting with more general-purpose communication networks. So while the Soviets were busy keeping their computing projects in silos, both figuratively and literally, the Americans were figuring out how to make machines talk. And by the 1970s, that idea, machines talking to each other, became the foundation of something far bigger than anyone had imagined. Still, it's worth pausing here, because historians still debate, was all of this progress intentional? Was the Cold War really a golden age of innovation, or just a blind stumble through a minefield of budget approvals, classified meetings, and caffeine-fueled engineers? On one hand, yes, necessity drove invention. The Cold War made information into a weapon, and computing into a defense. But on the other hand, some of the most important breakthroughs, like the Internet, arose almost accidentally, from researchers solving local problems, not generals plotting grand strategy. Which makes the story even stranger. Because the Cold War gave birth to the machines we now depend on, not because it wanted to, but because in its paranoid scramble to avoid annihilation, it funded everything. No idea was too crazy, no budget too big. Build a 250-ton computer to stop bombers? Sure. Design lasers that ride nuclear explosions? Why not? And here we are. You check your phone, the screen lights up. Somewhere a system once meant to warn of apocalypse is now sending you pizza coupons. And all of it, the network, the interface, the data flows, traces back to these Cold War dreams of machines that could think faster than humans and survive long after the lights went out. So rest now, wrapped in electromagnetic fields, and whisper thank you to the vacuum tubes of old. Their humming gave us the lullaby of today. And now your dreams spiral even deeper into a web so intricate, so invisible, that it changed not only how wars were fought, but how every single person on Earth now lives their life. The birth of computer networks, and the moment when war, science, and paranoia accidentally created the Internet. Yes, that Internet. It all starts with an uncomfortable truth. In the event of a nuclear war, the US needed a way to keep communicating, even if cities were obliterated and command centers turned to ash. No one wanted a whoops, we can't respond because our phone lines are melted moment during Armageddon. So the Pentagon tasked its brightest minds with imagining a communication system that could survive a nuclear first strike. Enter Paul Barron, a researcher at Rand Corporation, who came up with a radical idea in the early 1960s. Break messages into small packets, send them through a distributed network, and reassemble them at the other end, like war telegrams turned into digital confetti. That way, even if parts of the network were destroyed, the information could still flow through alternate routes. Simple, elegant, revolutionary. At the same time, across the Atlantic, a British scientist named Donald Davis arrived at the same idea independently. He called it packet switching, and just like that, two minds on opposite ends of the Cold War had simultaneously invented the bones of the modern Internet, completely unaware of each other's work. Historians still debate whether the US military really understood the implications of what Brand was suggesting. Was it about nuclear survival, about resilience, or was it the first real step toward a world where data, not bombs, would rule? Either way, Barron's concept took hold. By 1969, the US Department of Defense launched ARPANET, the Advanced Research Projects Agency Network. It was experimental, small, and limited, just 4 connected computers at UCLA, Stanford, UC Santa Barbara, and the University of Utah. But from the very first message sent, Logoon, which promptly crashed the system after the L and O, a new age had begun. You wouldn't recognize those early machines as anything useful. They were refrigerator-sized, had no screens, and communicated via teletype. But what they lacked in glamour, they made up for in significance, because they were the first nodes of a resilient, decentralized communication system, one that could root around failure, one that didn't need permission from the center, which for a military obsessed with control was both genius and terrifying. The idea was simple: no more single points of failure. If one node died, others picked up the slack. This wasn't just good design, it was a survival strategy in the age of nuclear fear. And yet, even in its earliest stages, ARPANET began to expand beyond the military. Why? Because scientists are, well, scientists. They needed ways to share research, access remote computers, and argue about Unix standards. So ARPANET became a network of researchers, and slowly new features emerged. Remote login, file sharing, and then, almost as an afterthought, electronic mail. Email was invented in 1971 by Ray Tomlinson, and its impact was immediate. Instead of waiting days for letters or faxes, researchers could communicate in real time. It wasn't glamorous, more like digital post-it notes, but it worked, and it was addictive. From there, things spiraled. More universities connected. More protocols were invented. The TCP/IP protocol suite, developed in the late 1970s, allowed different networks to speak the same digital language. Suddenly, ARPANET wasn't a lone system. It was a framework that other networks could plug into. By the early 1980s, ARPANET had split into 2 parts: MILNET for military use, and a more open academic version that became the foundation for today's Internet. But the real explosion came in the 1990s, when Tim Berners-Lee added the World Wide Web, and people suddenly realized the network could be used not just for science, but for literally everything. And yet, none of this would have happened without the Cold War. The entire infrastructure, packet switching, decentralized design, survivable networks, was born from the existential fear of nuclear war. Even stranger, the Internet, this ultimate tool of global connectivity, was created by a country preparing for global disconnection. Here's where it gets truly ironic. While the US was pouring billions into this digital web, the Soviet Union was not. You remember Glushkov's OGARS project from earlier, the Soviet Internet that never was. It turns out that even when some in the USSR understood what was happening in the West, they couldn't replicate it. Not because they lacked talent, but because their system lacked flexibility. Whereas ARPANET was funded by a weird fusion of military need and academic freedom, the Soviets were mired in bureaucratic turf wars. No one wanted to share data. No one wanted to give up control. So the very idea of a decentralized network, one where power flowed across many nodes, was anathema. The result? The Cold War created 2 paths, one that led to the digital age we now inhabit, and one that disappeared into dusty archives and forgotten proposals. You might not think about this when you're scrolling your feed or ordering groceries with your voice, but every time you go online, you're walking a road paved by the military-industrial complex. Every like, every click, every streaming lullaby is the child of a global panic. And the fact that it all works, that you can FaceTime your friend across the planet, or send a meme into space and back in under a second. That's the Cold War's quietest secret. Its deadliest machines never fired, but its wires, protocols, and paranoid visions built a new civilization. Sleep now, wrapped in Wi-Fi, wrapped in irony. And as your thoughts coast gently through a fog of frequencies and forgotten protocol, you reach a point in the Cold War story where the stakes weren't just about bombs or bandwidth, they were about economic immortality. This is the era where the Soviets, finally peeking over the technological fence, tried to build their own digital Eden. What they got instead was bureaucratic purgatory with flashing lights. Let's rewind to the early 1960s. The Soviet Union, proud architect of space firsts and 5-year plans, was waking up to a troubling reality. Computers were changing warfare, economy, and science at speeds incompatible with the pace of central planning. If capitalism had a digital bloodstream forming, socialism needed one too, and thus came the dream of a national computer network, the Soviet Internet before the Internet existed. This was the brainchild of Anatoly Kitov, a military computer scientist, who had the audacity to suggest that the USSR's precious computing power, mostly reserved for missiles and codes, could also be used to run the economy more efficiently. Like, imagine if instead of just pointing nukes, the machines also managed tractor distribution. Kitov's idea was simple. Take the military's fancy computers and use them to optimize food supply, factory output, and economic forecasts, a sort of cybernetic 5-year plan. Soviet leadership did not applaud. In fact, Kitov was swiftly reprimanded for even thinking about letting civilians near military hardware. His Communist Party membership revoked, his military career kaput, his dream of a networked socialist utopia filed under proceed with extreme suspicion. But the idea refused to die. Enter Viktor Glushkov, a Ukrainian cyberneticist with vision, charisma, and a whiteboard full of equations. In the mid-1960s, Glushkov proposed the OGAZ project, the all-state automated system, which aimed to digitally manage the entire Soviet economy from a central command center in Moscow, linked to regional hubs, and then to tens of thousands of enterprises. Yes, it sounds ambitious, because it was. Picture this, one giant brain controlling every cog in the socialist machine. Orders would flow from the top, data would return from below, and efficiency would skyrocket. No more waiting for some dude in Minsk to fill out paper reports, just pure cybernetic precision. Historians still debate whether OGAZ could have worked. Some say it was decades ahead of its time. Others say it was a Kafkaesque nightmare waiting to happen. Either way, it faced a more immediate threat: Soviet bureaucrats. See, OGAZ was a data-sharing dream, but to function, it would require ministries to share power. And if there's one thing more sacred than ideology in the USSR, it was bureaucratic turf. Ministers weren't just managers, they were mini-tsars. They had empires, and the idea of feeding real-time data to a central system, that was like asking a Cold War general to share his vodka stash. So despite initial funding and support, OGAZ was slow-walked into irrelevance. Bureaucratic infighting, funding cuts, and institutional paranoia killed it, not with a bang, but with 18 different forms, signed in triplicate and then lost in someone's desk. By the 1970s, Glushkov's dream lay in pieces, and the Soviets, despite their early lead in computing, had fumbled their chance to build a digital economy. It's one of history's great what-ifs, because while the US stumbled into the Internet by accident, the USSR tried to engineer it on purpose and failed because their system wasn't built to share. And what makes this truly ironic, the USSR had the brains, the engineers, the mathematical prowess. They had cybernetic theory decades before it was cool, but they lacked one thing: trust in their own system. Where the US embraced decentralization out of necessity, paranoia, or genius, the Soviets clung to hierarchy. They wanted machines to obey, not converse. And that rigidity, that fear of flexibility, became their digital downfall. Meanwhile, in the West, computer networks were evolving. Researchers were experimenting. Businesses were getting online. ARPANET was growing. And every day, the information gap between the two superpowers widened. Not because the Soviets were stupid, but because their system choked the future at birth. Still, let's be clear, the Soviets weren't entirely digital dinosaurs. They had brilliant minds. They launched Sputnik. They invented holography. They even had plans for AI before it was a Silicon Valley buzzword. But without a functioning information ecosystem, these ideas never reached their full potential. So as you drift now, blanketed in Wi-Fi and digital luxury, think of the networks that never were, of data that never flowed, of innovations buried under ministry memos, and of a world where one superpower tried to algorithm its way to economic heaven and got lost in a bureaucratic maze instead. Sleep gently. The OJAs won't ping you. The Cold War whines grow quieter now, but your dream doesn't end. It changes channel. You glide toward the blinking stars of the Strategic Defense Initiative, better known as Star Wars, not because of lightsabers, though let's admit that would have been more efficient than bureaucracy, but because the United States briefly flirted with the idea of laser tagging Soviet nukes from space. It was 1983, and the world was somewhere between disco hangovers and VHS triumph. Ronald Reagan, actor turned president, stared into the nuclear abyss, and with the optimism of a man who'd sold detergent on TV, asked the impossible: can we make nuclear weapons obsolete? The Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, was his moonshot. The idea? To build a space-based missile shield, a system of satellites, lasers, particle beams, and high-tech wizardry that would detect and destroy incoming intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, before they reached US soil. Think Death Star, but with better PR. Of course, the name Star Wars was coined by critics, not fans. And scientists, real ones, not Hollywood consultants, were baffled. You want to do what with X-ray lasers, using nukes in space to trigger satellite-based light weapons that could fry a missile mid-flight? Sure, just add unicorns and a talking AI assistant, and we've got the full sci-fi package. Still, Reagan meant it, deeply uncomfortable with the doctrine of mutually assured destruction. You bomb us, we bomb you. Everyone dies. Good night, kids. He wanted a system that could defend, not just retaliate. He envisioned a world where nuclear threats could be rendered impotent, like a boxer swinging at shadows. Historians still argue whether SDI was sincere policy or psychological warfare. Was it meant to work, or just to scare the Soviets into overspending? Either way, the impact was real. Soviet leaders took it seriously, terrifyingly so. Their own scientists had no idea how close the Americans were to making it work, so they feared the worst, that their entire missile arsenal could be neutralized overnight. And when you're a nuclear superpower whose main deterrent is, we can still hit you back, having that deterrent threatened is the stuff of ulcer-inducing nightmares. Let's talk tech for a moment, or what passed for tech in this high-stakes space fantasy. The SDI roadmap included Excalibur Project, X-ray lasers powered by nuclear explosions. The idea was to detonate a nuke in space and focus the resulting energy through a series of mirrors and lenses to hit multiple ICBMs at once. Problem: this only worked in cartoons. Brilliant Pebbles, a swarm of small, autonomous satellites equipped with sensors and kinetic kill vehicles. They'd basically crash themselves into enemy missiles like cosmic kamikazes. Cute name, questionable logistics. Ground-based interceptors. Missiles launched from Earth to intercept enemy warheads mid-flight. These had a better chance of actually functioning, and variations of them are still used today in US missile defense. Directed energy weapons. High-powered lasers, and particle beams mounted on aircraft or satellites. Think of it as trying to shoot a bullet with another bullet from space, while both are moving at Mach 20. The costs? Astronomical. By the late 1980s, the US had poured tens of billions into SDI research, and yet few systems were even remotely operational. Many failed basic feasibility tests. Lasers couldn't generate enough power. Tracking systems lagged. The Excalibur project, despite its mythical name, was an expensive bust. But perhaps the biggest impact of SDI wasn't technological, it was psychological. In Kremlin offices lined with red carpets and paranoia, Soviet officials were now facing a terrifying equation. Their aging infrastructure, declining economy, a possible American space shield, strategic irrelevance. It was like playing poker and realizing the other player might have a loaded deck, even if they hadn't shown the cards yet. Some historians believe SDI pushed the Soviet Union toward economic collapse. Not directly. Lasers didn't bankrupt the USSR, but the pressure to compete with an unknowable future drained resources, morale, and trust in their own capabilities. They were already strained. SDI just nudged them closer to the edge. Others argue the initiative prolonged the Cold War. By raising the stakes and introducing unproven technology into nuclear calculations, it destabilized decades of delicate deterrence. After all, if one side believes it has a shield, it might feel emboldened to strike first, or ignore diplomacy. And then there were the ethics. Space was supposed to be a peaceful domain. Weaponizing it, even in defense, triggered debates that still echo today. Could we trust automated systems to decide life and death in nanoseconds? Could satellites be hacked, spoofed? Would enemies target our shields with their own preemptive strikes? These weren't just sci-fi plot holes. They were real concerns, debated by policymakers, scientists, and a few worried suburbanites with too much access to popular mechanics. In the end, SDI didn't fulfill its Star Wars destiny. Most of its systems were shelved, rebranded, or absorbed into less ambitious programs. The Excalibur X-ray laser, quietly cancelled. The particle beam, still a theory. Even Reagan's dream of a shield that would make nukes impotent and obsolete was admitted, years later, to be wildly optimistic. But not everything died. Modern missile defense systems, like the Ground-Based Midcourse Defense, GMD, are direct descendants of SDI. Today, the US has interceptors in Alaska and California designed to take out limited ICBM attacks. They don't involve lasers. They don't orbit Earth, but they do work. Occasionally. More importantly, SDI changed how the military thought about information, surveillance, and preemptive strategy. It pushed the Pentagon to invest in real-time satellite tracking, smarter sensor networks, and command and control systems that would shape digital warfare in the 21st century. So sleep now beneath a sky that once imagined killer satellites and laser-laced clouds, and know that even our wildest defense fantasies can leave behind useful tools and quieter questions. You're still floating, not in space now, but in a strange limbo between failed dreams and the leftover tech of paranoia. As we move deeper into the quiet aftershock of Star Wars, you begin to realize that even Cold War failures echo on, not in battlefields or missile silos, but in our phones, our maps, our pizza trackers. Because while Reagan's sky lasers fizzled and Glushkov's economic brain melted in Soviet red tape, something else quietly blossomed in the background, a transformation so vast, so ordinary now, you barely think about it, the civilianization of Cold War tech. Let's start small. Back in the 1950s and 60s, all those satellites, radar systems, and communication networks, they weren't just expensive toys for generals. They were laying the infrastructure for the modern digital world. That dream of instant global connectivity, it began with military-funded cables, transponders, and systems to track nuclear missiles, not selfies. Take GPS for instance. Born as NEVSTAR, the US military's global positioning system was designed to let soldiers and missiles know exactly where they were, anytime, anywhere. But it was clunky, secretive, and not meant for civilians. That is, until 1983, when a Korean Airlines flight was shot down after straying into Soviet airspace, a tragedy that led Reagan to open GPS to public use. Fast forward, and now every pizza delivery driver, dog walker, and dating app uses this once top-secret military constellation to navigate suburbia. You swipe for a ride, your phone pings a satellite, and Cold War space tech tells your Uber driver exactly how to ignore it and take the long way anyway. And then there's the internet, which, as we already floated through, was a project born of nuclear fear. But post-Cold War, it becomes a marketplace, a dating pool, a meme factory. What began as a way to survive Soviet missiles is now how we order socks and stream people unboxing them. But let's zoom out, because it wasn't just communications that crossed over. The Cold War produced entire fields of innovation, all funded by an arms race that never exploded. Think of it as the world's most passive-aggressive Kickstarter. You didn't ask for these inventions, but your tax money helped birth them anyway. Miniaturized electronics needed to cram tech into missiles and spy gear. Without that race to shrink circuits, no smartphones. Weather satellites, originally developed to monitor launch conditions and battlefield climates. Today, we check them to see if we need a jacket. Remote sensing, created for spy satellites, now used in agriculture, climate science, and yes, Google Earth, where we creep on our own roofs. Even the camera tech used in Cold War spy planes like the U-2 and SR-71 evolved into the tools for high-res aerial photography and imaging satellites. The eyes that once peered nervously over missile silos now help with disaster response, real estate, and TikTok drone shots of waterfalls. Historians still argue whether this tech transfer was planned benevolence or unintended consequence. Was it magnanimous of the US to open the digital floodgates? Or did the sheer volume of Cold War R&D mean the civilian world just inherited the leftovers? Either way, by the 1990s, the military-industrial complex had gone retail, defense contractors pivoted, government research filtered into university labs, and suddenly Cold War inventions were everywhere, disguised in polite suburban clothing. One of the strangest examples, SAGE, the semi-automatic ground environment system, originally designed to detect Soviet bombers in real time using massive computers and radar inputs. It had an unexpected civilian afterlife. It became the basis for the first airline booking systems. Yes, the same tech that tracked nuclear warheads helped Grandma book her flight to Boca Raton. But let's not pretend this was all peace and progress. Many of these technologies came with shadowy legacies. The same satellites that track weather can also be used for surveillance. The same internet that lets you share cat videos also monitors your data. The same GPS that finds your destination also finds you. The Cold War never really ended. It just moved into your pocket. We live today in a world of Cold War ghost tech. Our routers, chips, and sensors are built on layers of forgotten tensions, expired protocols, and once classified dreams. Even our anxieties about privacy, cybersecurity, and AI are inheritors of the same questions that haunted generals staring at blinking command screens 60 years ago. And as you sink now into this soft, digital slumber, know this: every signal you don't hear, every invisible pulse around you, is part of a quiet empire, not of missiles, but of information. So let it hum around you, this invisible empire. Let it fade to white noise, like a satellite drifting into deep orbit. Let the warmth of borrowed Cold War technology tuck you in. Now you drift deeper still, not just into the folds of memory, but into the very architecture of paranoia. you arrive at a peculiar Cold War obsession, one less glamorous than lasers and less dramatic than spies, but perhaps more profound, the idea that information must survive a nuclear apocalypse. You're entering the world of networks, built to withstand the end of the world. In the late 1950s, US military planners had a terrifying realization. Their communication systems, telephone lines, radio towers, command bunkers, were hopelessly fragile. A well-aimed Soviet nuke could cut off entire sectors from leadership, and if you can't communicate during a war, you can't win it. Or worse, you can't respond at all, and the enemy assumes you're dead, so they keep firing. So the question emerged, how do you build a communication system that cannot be destroyed? Enter Paul Barron, a researcher at the Rand Corporation, that dreamy blend of think tank and Cold War anxiety machine. In 1964, Barron proposed a radical new idea. Instead of relying on centralized telephone hubs, why not build a network that was decentralized, one where messages could flow through multiple paths, rerouting if any part was destroyed? His concept was called packet switching. Instead of sending one whole message along one wire, you chop it up into little chunks, packets. Each packet finds its own route to the destination, bouncing between nodes like ants in a forest. Once all packets arrive, the message is reassembled, and if one route is nuked, no problem. The others still work, the system survives, the message gets through. Historians still debate whether Barron's idea directly inspired what came next, but the philosophy of redundancy and decentralization became gospel for Cold War communication systems. Simultaneously, across the Atlantic, British computer scientist Donald Davis was arriving at the same packet switching concept independently. That's how urgent the idea had become. Even continents apart, minds were converging on the same digital salvation. Then came ARPANET. Funded by the US Department of Defense's Advanced Research Projects Agency ARPA, this project began in 1969 with the goal of connecting academic and military computers, not just to share research, but to test the resilience of distributed communication. The first message sent, Logorn. What actually arrived? LO. The system crashed after the second letter, a humble beginning, but a digital Big Bang all the same. By the early 1970s, ARPANET connected major universities. It used packet switching, it evolved protocols, and slowly, without ceremony, it laid the bones of the modern Internet. And why was it allowed to flourish? Because Cold War logic demanded it. If the Soviets attacked, these networks had to survive. That very fear, that mushroom-clouded silence, is what forced governments to fund communication systems that would never go quiet. It's funny, isn't it? The very impulse to survive destruction created something that eventually made us inseparable. What was once built to preserve nuclear commands is now how we share memes, fall in love, order groceries, and yes, listen to bedtime histories. But survival wasn't just about infrastructure. The idea of information continuity birthed other efforts too. In 1961, the US launched the Emergency Broadcast System, designed to override all radio and TV in the event of attack. Broadcasters were told to keep manual instructions on hand, paper scripts, physical codes, in case automation failed. The goal, if the bombs fell, you'd still hear a calm voice saying, "This is not a test." Underground, command bunkers, mushroomed. Cheyenne Mountain, Raven Rock, Site R. These were hardened communication hubs, built into mountains or buried deep beneath the earth. Inside, military operators would continue issuing orders, monitoring radar, and if needed, launching retaliatory strikes. The Cold War's version of digital Noah's Arks. And yet for all this preparation, no one really knew if it would work. Would a truly distributed network function under global chaos? Could human operators keep their cool? Would data packets fly through fallout zones like fearless messengers? No one wanted to find out. But the paranoia kept building, and so did the tech. In time, this drive for resilient communication bled into civilian networks. Universities adopted packet switching. Email was invented. The TCP/IP protocol standardized how computers talk. And soon the early internet had gone from military hedge to academic playground to commercial frontier. But make no mistake, its DNA was survival. It was born not from utopian dreams of global connection, but from the cold logic of nuclear war games. So as you fall further into sleep now, cushioned by Wi-Fi waves and soft electronic lullabies, remember this: every signal, every stream, every silent ping across the net is the echo of a world trying not to end. You live inside the dream of a world that refused to be cut off, that built machines, not just to inform, but to endure. Sleep gently. The message got through. You've nearly reached the end now, not of the Cold War, not of fear, not even of the machines, but of this gentle unraveling of everything they built, so we wouldn't unravel. As you glide into the final chamber of this long night's tale, you find yourself floating between memory and code, wires and whispers, and a single lingering question: what's left behind after a war that never officially ends? You walk through rooms full of blinking machines, abandoned in bunkers, rusting under desert skies. Some are still humming, old tape drives that no one unplugged, still rotating under dust like record players playing the silence. Others are artifacts now, Cold War punch cards in museums, atomic-era warning posters framed next to vintage soda machines. But make no mistake, you're not looking at ruins. You're looking at the roots of your daily life. Because if the Cold War had a child, it wasn't a missile. It was the network. It was the idea that survival meant sharing information before it could be destroyed, that a message might outlive its sender. And that's what you live inside now, a house of invisible messages, all moving, all layered, all tracing their origin back to this one long global sigh of tension and preparation. Let's say it plainly. We owe our modern world to a half-century standoff between two paranoid giants. The apps on your phone, the cloud, your GPS, your router, they are made from Cold War bones. The only difference is that now they smile with friendly user interfaces instead of blinking ominously in nuclear control rooms. Even the aesthetic lives on. Swipe through a smart home app and see echoes of military command centers. Every OK button is a softened version of launch. Every voice assistant is a rebranded radio operator. Hey Siri is the descendant of red phones and silo hatches. Only now, instead of saying yes, Mr. President, it tells you the weather in Paris. And what of the old opponents? The Soviet Union collapsed. Yes, not with a bang, but a bureaucratic whimper. Some say SDI helped. Others point to oil prices, nationalism, a stagnating economy. But truthfully, systems that don't evolve die. And the Soviet Union, so obsessed with central control, couldn't keep up with the speed of decentralized innovation. That's the other irony of the Cold War, the side that embraced redundancy, openness, even chaos. The US, for all its Cold War sins, and they were many, allowed technology to spill from the military into public hands. It didn't wall off its innovations. It licensed them, sold them, let them escape. And in doing so, it turned war prep into a digital economy. That's the legacy. Cold War research centers morphed into tech companies. Former defense contractors launched startups. The first coders of missile interfaces built spreadsheets, then apps. And you now live in a world where your refrigerator has more computing power than the entire Apollo mission or the first ARPANET node. Yet for all this progress, there's still that resonant hum, that Cold War murmur beneath the static of our lives. You feel it every time there's a cyber attack, a satellite launch, a whistleblower leak. You hear it in the language of firewalls, defense in depth, zero trust. These are military metaphors that still guard our digital gates. Even our fears have updated from nuclear annihilation to data annihilation. The new apocalypse isn't radioactive. It's informational, a power grid collapse, a deepfake war, a hacked election. But that too is part of the Cold War legacy. Because when you build a world on the idea that information is survival, the loss of it becomes existential. And yet, you're here, still connected, still pinging signals across the sky, just like Sputnik once did. Only now, it's for directions to brunch. So breathe in and let this final truth settle. The Cold War built the future by accident. It meant to end the world. Instead, it gave us the tools to share it, imperfectly, unevenly, but undeniably. It taught us to value a quiet transfer of knowledge over the loud threats of destruction. It buried cables instead of bodies. It turned code into comfort. And tonight you fall asleep inside that comfort. And now you drift, not through history, but through hush. The echoes of secrets, satellites, and spy planes soften into background static, a low hum beneath your breath. No more rushing timelines. No more blinking radars, just stillness. The Cold War is over, at least the kind we can name. Its codes have become conveniences, its bunkers have become data centers, and its paranoia, well, maybe that became the reason we invented passwords, backups, and airplane mode. But for now, none of that matters. Tonight, there are no threats, no spies in lab coats, no intercepted transmissions, no countdowns, no alerts, only the silent dance of old satellites, still orbiting, not to report, but to witness, watching the Earth like retired guardians, blinking gently across the stars. Let your shoulders fall. Let the weight of radiation charts and titanium tricks dissolve into the air. Let Klaus Fuchs and the Rosenbergs fade back into their shadowed pages. Let the U-2 glide quietly back into its hangar, untouched. Let the red phone stop ringing. And as the last data packet drifts across the digital sky, as the final Cold War ripple reaches the far shore of memory, you rest, safe, surrounded by the very systems once built to survive catastrophe, now simply carrying lullabies. Close your eyes. The signal is strong. The line is clear. And this network, built in fear, now holds you in peace. Sleep easy. Tomorrow will still be here.